Our culture has a broken relationship with food, but it's not really about food, is it? It's about how we've been taught to think about being alive, what it means to have a body, to be a body. And today it's time to talk about where this really went wrong. This topic is really important to me because I started my working life after spending time at university getting qualified for this job in the fitness industry. And that is an industry that is not so great at helping people to actually become the people that they are supposed to be. It really doubled down on some of the not great cultural themes that were cruising around in the last few decades. So on top of working for a decade in the health and fitness industry, I sort of came of age in the mid-90s through mid-2000s, which was at peak diet culture in the whole sort of realm of Western culture. It was at peak thinness, peak just restriction and calorie counting and all of that stuff. So I was bringing this cultural programming around restriction and never being good enough and thinness being the ultimate goal above all other elements of being alive with me into my work in the fitness industry. And the fitness industry just doubled down on all of those harmful themes, all of those harmful cultural conditioning, because the fitness industry can't exist without making people feel bad about themselves. I'm going to tell you about the moment. It's a story about the moment where I sort of had a realization, and it was the beginning of the end of my time in the fitness industry. I mean, I didn't walk out the door and never go back, but it was the beginning of changing how I thought about it and ultimately realizing that this wasn't something that I wanted to be a part of anymore. And the moment was this. I had a client, and she was this beautiful teenage girl who was just so strong and healthy and sporty and so great at everything that she did. And she was coming to me, and I was doing my job. I was programming her exercise and her nutrition and measuring her progress. And I was standing there with her one day, and we were doing a progress measure, and I'm measuring, around her waist and her hips and putting her on the body fat percentage scales and writing everything down and comparing it to the last time. And it was just a moment of, this is not okay. This is this wonderful young woman who is just vibrant and beautiful and healthy and is just at her peak most wonderfulness. And here I am essentially telling her that she's not okay, she's not enough. And she was a young woman who had a body type that's quite similar to mine. So she was never going to be naturally thin. It wasn't in the cards for her. Neither her nor I were ever going to look like the girls on TV or in the magazines at the time, the cultural moment where this happened. And it was a moment. Now, I didn't change my mind straight away. I didn't walk out the door, but it started to break down some of that cultural conditioning, because I thought to myself, this is not okay. There is nothing wrong. There is nothing to change or fix or improve here. And it's not okay. Who am I to tell this girl that she is not enough? So that was the moment that started me thinking more critically about the industry that I was a part of. And over time, I realized that the fitness industry, and now we would call this the wellness industry or the health industry, because they've sort of rebranded over time to keep selling their products and services. But ultimately, it's the same thing as it was back then. And that is is that the industry, the wellness industry, relies on telling people that they cannot trust themselves. It relies on them telling people that they are broken and need to be fixed, and that if you just do this, buy that, do this program, go on that diet, listen to this person, you can have happiness sometime soon, just around the corner. But that happiness is never achievable because there's always something else that you need to do before you can be fixed or unbroken. It is an industry that absolutely relies on keeping people feeling like they are not enough. And ultimately, I just couldn't be part of an industry that put those thoughts into people's heads in order to make money and keep itself going. This is the inverse, the opposite of the themes that I explored in the Joy of Chickening video. So in this instance, you've got shame and restriction stacking into patterns, into habits that ultimately become more and more harmful to the person doing these activities, instead of joy and peace and gentleness stacking into a life that has more and more joy in it. But it wasn't just that industry. I realized that the problem here was how our entire culture thinks about being alive, about being a person. Because I went into my university studies, I went into that industry already with thinking about how I was as a person that wasn't conducive to living a happy, fulfilled life. Here's the thing, wild animals don't need nutritionists. Deer don't count their macros. Wolves don't track their protein intake. Our flock of chickens, they can choose to eat the foods that are going to be best for them if they have that opportunity to make those choices. Even the animals that we have domesticated, when we give them the choice, when we give them environments where they can choose what foods they are eating, they will make good choices that nourish their bodies and meet their nutritional requirements. All animals have this ability innate within them. So what happened to humans? Well, we can do this too. We have this ability within us to choose foods and ways of being that are good for us, that nourish us. But that knowing has been corrupted. It's been corrupted by our culture, by the way we are taught to think. And it is corrupted by the highly processed foods that we are given to eat. This culture, this corrupted way of thinking is the Western industrial mindset. It's a machine consciousness where everyone, everything that is alive is reduced down and thought of compared to being non-living things. Everyone is viewed as having parts and not as a complete whole, as a complete living being. We think of food as being fuel for our bodies. We think of our bodies as just being the vehicle that our intellect, our mind drives around in this life, where we separate out all of the different things that make us alive. We say that our hearts are like a pump. We say our joints are like hinges. We say that the mitochondria in our cells are like power plants that are creating the energy to fuel our body. And we compare our brains to computers, even though our brains were the inspiration for creating computers in the first place. What this thinking does is it makes us passengers in our lives rather than living beings. It disconnects us from our innate wisdom, and it teaches us not to trust that wisdom inside ourselves and to instead rely on external inputs, to rely on systems and rules and authority, because we couldn't possibly trust ourselves because we're not really alive. We're just that brain, that mind driving around our body as a vehicle, and we can't know what we actually do know inside ourselves, that we can be healthy and make good choices for ourselves, innate inside us. We still have that wisdom. But this mindset, this thinking, doesn't want us to trust that wisdom. It wants us to trust in the systems around us. It primes you to need experts to tell you how to live in your own body. You are not just driving a meat vehicle around. You are your body. Your body, your mind, your spirit is all one interconnected organism. The best illustration of this whole concept is the works of Weston Price. Now, he was a dentist in the 1930s, and he was seeing that the health, and particularly the dental health of people, was declining. And he happened to live at a time where there were still peoples living in their traditional ways. So he started out on an expedition to go and meet these people that were still living in their traditional ways. And he wrote this book about what he found in his travels called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. It's a great book to read, and I would highly recommend that you have a go at reading it if you can track it down. And what he found, because this was just the perfect time in history where he could see peoples that were both living their traditional, healthy, strong lives that they had been doing for centuries or millennia, and also as those people transitioned to more modern industrial foods, he could see what was happening in their populations. So Weston Price went and met these groups of people still being able to live their traditional lives, their traditional cultures. These groups of people that Weston Price went to meet and talk to, they were not restricting things in their diet. They were not tracking things in their diet. They were eating the foods that their land provided for them. They had traditions around these foods in terms of how they prepared them and how they ate them. And they knew what their land provided for them. And these foods were vastly different depending on where the groups in the world were living. And Weston Price went essentially all over the globe in all sorts of different geographies and climates. But the people ate what their land provided, and they knew innately what was good for them. And they had traditions of food that were good for mothers and for small children that would allow them to grow healthy and strong. These people had great health. They had excellent teeth, and they were strong with healthy bodies. They were vibrantly healthy people. And they were that way because they followed the traditions that had been handed down for them. And the food they ate had not been engineered to confuse them. Because this was in a time where it was sort of a turning point in history, where the Western diet, the Western foods were starting to be rolled out around the globe, Weston Price was able to see what happened to these groups of people when they started to transition to a more modern diet that consisted of more refined foods and more sugars and more packaged foods and processed foods. And he was able to see that the health of the people started to suffer when they did that. Their physical health was not as good. They became more susceptible to illnesses, including tuberculosis, which was a major issue around the globe at this time. And their children were not as healthy and strong. They started to get dental decay and to have teeth that would start to crowd in their mouths, just like Western populations had been having for generations. And really the reason that Weston Price started out on this journey in the first place, because he was pretty convinced that this was not the natural way humans were supposed to be. He wasn't convinced that ill health and crowded tooth, decayed-filled teeth was the way that humans were supposed to be. Now, Weston Price wrote that book in the 1930s, and it can be a little bit difficult to get through because the way he's written it is not really how we expect to read a book today. But there is a book that is a little bit more modern, that might be a more accessible point for people to have a look deeper into these concepts, and that is the book Deep Nutrition by Catherine Shanahan. Now, this is her original book published in 2009, and that's the one that I have, but she does have a revised version that was published in 2019, and that really has a great way of bringing modern scientific knowledge into the traditional wisdom. It sort of brings them together in a book that is a bit more accessible for modern readers and also brings in science that Weston Price didn't have because we hadn't done it yet. So Catherine Shanahan tries to bring this information into a more accessible form, and she brings this knowledge around what she calls the 4 pillars. And those 4 pillars are to eat meat on the bone, incorporate organ meats into your diet, to eat sprouted and fermented foods, and to eat whole, fresh, unprocessed foods. So it's quite nice and simple. The 2019 version also includes a section on how to incorporate these principles into a plant-based diet. So it's really quite an accessible book for people, no matter what way they want to eat. Basically, the message of both of these books is that our bodies know how to work with real whole foods, but they don't know what to do with processed, refined, food-like substances. One of the main components of how we are kept in this broken, unhealthy state is the industrial food system, because it provides us with food, well, not really food stuff that doesn't provide us with nutritionally dense food that our bodies need. It provides us with food stuff that is nutritionally devoid and designed, engineered to override our innate wisdom in choosing foods that are actually good for us. We can't trust the innate wisdom of our bodies when that wisdom has been corrupted by years, or in some cases, generations of consumption of these not food items. At this point, we haven't listened to our bodies for so long that the only way they can communicate with us now is to essentially start to break down into massive dysfunction. We're having metabolic dysfunction, diabetes, obesity, autoimmune conditions, just all of these health conditions, these chronic health conditions that are not things that pass from person to person. They're not like measles or the flu. These are chronic health conditions arising essentially from our own bodies, essentially screaming at us to do something different. This is where diet culture and the whole well-being, wellness industry comes in and sets itself up as a false saviour, but it is only offering more restriction and more control. It is still operating out of the same machine mindset that got us into this mess in the first place. It is still treating you like you're just a meat vehicle that needs better programming. It is still selling dissatisfaction. It is still promising happiness at some point in the distant future if you just follow this easy set of rules. It becomes a vicious cycle where you are applying restriction, which makes you feel deprived, which leads you to break that restriction and feel failure after breaking the rules, and then shame, which leads to harder doubling down on more restriction. And it is just a cycle that keeps flowing and gets us nowhere. It is a cycle that only leads to bad outcomes and not happiness or joy or good outcomes. Here's what I've learned on this journey, what I wish I could have gone back and told that young woman, my client with the measuring tape around her waist, what I could have told myself back then. We are all living this beautiful, messy, incarnate, embodied life full of all its joy and all its grief together. We are not machines to be optimized. We are not vehicles to be driven around in this life. We are living, breathing organisms who belong to this earth, who are supposed to eat food that comes from this earth. Our bodies know with deep wisdom how to nourish ourselves. But we have been disconnected from that knowing. And finding our way back isn't about finding another system, another set of rules, another restriction. It's about finding our way back to who we really are. But how do we do that? Well, you start by trying to eat real food. Not because it's a diet, not because I say so, but because our bodies recognize it, because it hasn't been engineered to confuse our body, because it is what we need to truly be healthy. And then notice what happens, not with the scales or a measuring tape. Notice with genuine curiosity what happens in your body. How do you feel? How are your energy levels? How are you sleeping? What is your body able to tell you about the way you are eating now? When something brings you genuine well-being, you want more of it. Your body says, yes, I want more of that thing. And that starts to stack together. Those can start to become habits, not because you are forcing it to happen, but because it is actually bringing genuine health and well-being into your life. And you want to seek more of that. It can take time to work through this process because it's quite likely that your body has been confused and corrupted from decades or potentially generations of industrial food that has really messed things up. But you do have this wisdom inside you. Every living thing does. You can learn to trust yourself, but it might take time, and be gentle with yourself throughout this process as you embark on eating real foods and seeking nutritionally dense foods. Your body will start to respond to that because it is getting what it needs to be vibrantly healthy, possibly for the first time in your life. And you can learn to trust your body as your body learns to trust the food that you're now giving it. This is an invitation to come home to yourself, to trust the living, breathing organism that you are, to remember we are not machines. We are here to be alive, to live this embodied life with all its joy and sorrow. That young lady from the beginning of this video, my client, she was already enough. I am already enough. Everyone watching this video is already enough.